So in this video, the final video in our lecture on island biogeography, this is where we're going to start to get into the theory and mathematical modeling behind how we actually estimate the number of species that an island can support. So this video in particular will be very important for completing your island biogeography assignment. I did want to note that the assignment is only worth 5%, but it is a very important one to complete and to put some thought into because it's going to help you get a better understanding of the equilibrium theory of biogeography. And you'll need this understanding in order to answer questions on your final exam. So, patterns of island biogeography, some basics basically. Species richness is strongly correlated with island size, and this has been shown from countless studies in varying habitats. I'll show you a couple examples. Larger islands support more species of plants and animals than small islands. Again, we're generalizing here, but this general pattern does hold. And this pattern holds at both the local and the global scale. So here we have an example of that relationship between island size and species diversity, looking at a number of plant species in the Galapagos archipelago. So in the Galapagos, the larger islands will support over 300 plant species, and the smaller islands will support only a handful of species. Now here we have this exact same relationship, this same increase in number of species as island size increases, but this time we're showing it now for reptile species diversity in the Caribbean. So if you wanted to test some of your biogeography knowledge, this would be a good place to pause the video and write down some ideas you have as to why you think this relationship might exist. So why would larger islands typically support greater biodiversity than smaller islands? Again, talking about plants to reptiles to really any type of animal, this relationship is frequently observed. So again, take a minute to think about why that might be the case. So hopefully you took my advice and you did pause the video on the last slide. And now here is where you're going to test your own biogeography knowledge. So let's see how many of you came up with some of the reasons that I've listed here. So several possible explanations for why larger islands can support more species. A larger island is going to have an increased variety of habitats. So again, think about the importance of microclimates, diversity of soil conditions. If you are talking about animal species, plant diversity is going to play a role. If larger islands support a greater diversity of plants, then this can support a greater diversity of things like insects and birds. So larger islands, more different kinds of habitats. Larger islands will also have a wider range of environmental conditions in general. They're going to tend to have greater environmental stability, less disturbance, more refuge in poor weather conditions. So I guess if you think about where you would want to be in the middle of a major hurricane or storm event, you would want to be on a larger island where you're more likely to find places to shelter from the storm. So larger islands tend to be more stable. Less intense competition for resources. So larger islands have more resources than smaller islands. So smaller islands are going to have more intense competition, which could limit the number of species that island could support. And just on sort of a similar vein, if you have a larger area, then predation can be spread more evenly amongst species. So less intense competition and perhaps less intense predation as well, which would both help support a greater number of species. And I'd be interested to see if you came up with any reasons that I don't have on this list. Just because it's not here doesn't mean that it was wrong. So to recap, there is a positive relationship between island size and species diversity, and this relationship holds globally and locally for a wide number of different types of species, but is the relationship always the same in every case? Do you have the exact same slope of that regression line, for example, if you think about the Galapagos plant example and the reptiles from the Caribbean? So this is where we're going to start to get into some of the math, and this is also what your assignment is on. So we can visualize this relationship between island size and species diversity using the species area curve equation. And you're actually going to calculate this for your assignment using a theoretical data set that I've given you. So the species area equation, S equals CA to the Z. So S equals the number of species, A equals island area, and C and Z are constants. And here I've calculated species area equations for both the Galapagos plants and Caribbean reptiles example. So if you look at both of these equations, you'll note that Z is more or less the same for both examples, but C can be quite different. So the value for Z on islands is usually going to fall somewhere around 0.3, but the value of C can vary greatly. And you can plot this exact same relationship on the mainland. You can apply theories of island biogeography to the mainland as well. So when we're thinking about island biogeography in terms of the mainland, instead of looking at island chains, imagine that you've gone out into one of the woodlots on campus and you've set up quadrants. So you've outlined little squares in the woodlot to count the number of species within that set area. Maybe some of you did this for your independent project or have done this for past ecology courses. So you've set up your quadrant. You can set up quadrants of varying area. So you can set up a very small quadrant and you can set up very large quadrants. And just like small islands generally supporting fewer species than large islands, you could also intuitively imagine that your larger plots you're going to find more species than you will in your smaller plots. Again, just like a large versus a small island. And then you can create the same species area equations, but instead of using island area, it would be quadrant area. So on the mainland, the value of Z should fall somewhere within the range of 0.15 to 0.25 for the mainland, as opposed to that value of 0.3 that is fairly constant for islands. So if you visualize it, the slope of the species area line is steeper for islands than it is for the mainland. And this might start to make more sense to you as you start to generate your own species area response curves for your assignment. So why is the value of Z different between islands and the mainland? So why is the value of Z greater for islands than it is to the mainland? Well, there's a few reasons. The boundaries of islands are strong barriers to species. So on the mainland, animals sampled in continental areas, they can forage for resources beyond the limits of the study area. So when you set up your plots in a woodlot, for example, you can have immigration from outside the plot area being very likely to occur, whereas immigration to islands is very, very limited. So think about pollen, for example, or plant spores. It's much easier for them to disperse within a continental area than to have to disperse over an ocean. So the boundaries of islands are strong barriers to species, which accounts for some of the differences that we see when we calculate our species area equations. So if we continue to think about islands and oceans as being strong barriers to species dispersal, it's a bit of a hint as to another factor of islands that's very important for determining the number of species that are going to be there. So it's not just island size that's going to be important for the number of species you find on that island, but also distance from a source of colonizers. So if we'd been able to finish out your labs as I had hoped the strike would be less than 2 months and we could have at least done the island biogeography lab, but we have to make do with what we have been given, I guess. But you would have mimicked this using playing cards. So what I would have had you done is you would have taped squares on the floor and designated someone to toss cards, throwing cards, towards these squares from varying distances away. And what you would learn very quickly from doing this is that unless your thrower has absolutely spectacular aim, you're going to be much more successful landing the card within those taped squares the closer you are to your target. So the farther away you are, the farther you have to throw your card, the more likely you are to miss that square that you've taped on the floor. And it's the same idea for species dispersing to islands from the mainland. The shorter the distance to travel, the much more likely you are to have a successful dispersal event. So, just like larger islands support more species, islands that are closer to the mainland support more species than islands that are farther away. So far we've just been talking about the number of species that are found on an island, and we haven't thought much about the community of species on the island. Well, we can think about island communities as being a nested pattern of insular communities. So if you remember, insular means islands. So the community of species on islands are generally going to be a subset of species found on nearby continents. So it's rare to have communities on a nearby larger island that aren't also represented on the mainland. Now, I'm sure I've confused you here because I've shown you countless examples throughout the course of endemic species that are only found on islands. So how can you have endemic species and have these species not be represented on the mainland? So doesn't this break with this idea of a nested pattern of insular communities? Well, of course, this pattern is broken by the common case of endemism observed on islands. Now, the degree of endemism is going to be related to isolation and the time since isolation began. So, islands that have been isolated for a long time and are a farther distance from the mainland are more likely to show or contain species that aren't represented on the mainland. So this is where I would ask you to recall the very first video in this series, this Island Biogeography lecture, where I talked about the importance of island geological history and mode of formation. And I'm also going to ask you to remember here our lecture on evolution and speciation. For speciation to occur, you need a barrier to dispersal. So in this case, instead of thinking of a nested pattern of insular communities in terms of specific species, you'd be looking for a common ancestor in your nested insular communities. Alright, so now it is time to get into the specifics of the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. And this is one of the most influential works in modern ecology today, and it originated in 1963 by Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson. So 1963, but it's still in use today, and the equilibrium theory of biogeography is still being modified today. So it's quite influential, not just in the field of biogeography, but in ecology and evolution in general. So right off the bat, I want to bring to your attention there are two key assumptions of the island theory of biogeography, so keep these both in mind. The first assumption is that on most islands, species richness is going to be in equilibrium with immigration and extinction. So immigration is going to be your source of new species, and extinction is going to be your main method for loss of species. And the second assumption is that there's no major environmental change occurring, or in other words, that richness is going to vary around a stable mean even if community composition is changing. So you can have species turnover, but your species richness is in equilibrium. So the species richness is not changing. New species might be arriving and old species might be going extinct, but species richness, the total number of species you have on that island, is going to stay the same. So that's the key assumption of the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. The equilibrium theory of island biogeography can be visualized by comparing colonization and extinction curves. So let's look first at the colonization curve, so immigration of new species on this figure here. The rate of colonization is going to start off very high and then slow down over time. And the idea behind that is good dispersers are going to very quickly reach the new island. But over time, the rate of arrival of new species is going to start to slow down because those good, effective dispersers are already there. So now you're looking at dispersal of species that have a harder time crossing that oceanic barrier. So colonization rates start off high. You have a lot of new species arriving shortly after an island forms, and eventually the arrival of new species is going to slow down. And you're going to have no new species arriving because those species are already present. So let's look now at the extinction curve. So extinction of existing species. The extinction curve does the opposite of the colonization curve. So extinction rates, again the loss of species, is going to start out slow and gradually increase over time as resources are used up and competition is increased. Now, where these two curves intersect, so your colonization or immigration curve and your extinction curve, where they cross, and this is shown by the dotted line here, that is going to be your equilibrium number of species that that island can support. So again, look at the point where these curves intersect and follow that dotted line down to the x-axis, number of species present. Where that point falls, that is your equilibrium species richness. So unless there is some major environmental change, some disruption to the status quo, in other words, your species richness is knocked out of equilibrium, this is the number of species that island in question can support, where this dotted line falls. Again, the types of species can change, so you can have new species colonize and outcompete established ones, but the total number of species is going to stay the same. It's going to stay at this number where your immigration and extinction curves intersect. So that equilibrium number of species, where those curves eventually intersect, the number of species that can be supported on an island, is going to vary based on, you guessed it, island size and degree of island isolation, so how close that island is to the mainland. And with the basic model for equilibrium theory of biogeography, island isolation is going to be related to your immigration curve, and island area is going to be related to your extinction curve. So the more isolated your island, the slower the rate of extinction. So if you look at the immigration curves here, the red lines, the far islands, again, have a slower rate of immigration than near islands. So immigration related to distance from the mainland. Now, if you look at your extinction curves, the blue lines, you can see that you have higher rates of extinction for small islands compared to larger islands. So your extinction curve is related to island size. So again, this is the basic model for equilibrium theory of biogeography. We're going to start to make it more complicated in a bit, but this is the equilibrium model in its simplest form. So again, remember, in the simplest model of equilibrium theory of island biogeography, island isolation influences immigration rate, and island size influences your extinction rate. So as upper year students in biology and geography, I imagine most of you likely appreciate that the relationship is going to be much more complicated than this in actuality. You know, we've already throughout the course talked about several factors not considered in this basic model that can affect species diversity. But the reason that equilibrium theory of island biogeography has been so influential is because even though it's a simplified model, what this theory gives us is a structured framework for hypothesis testing, just like some of you might have done in your independent assignments. So this theory gives us a background with which to design our studies and interpret our study results. So for example, you can go and you can go visit an archipelago or an island chain, and you can examine species diversity on those islands. And you can ask the question, does the relationship between species diversity, isolation, and size follow what you would expect based on the equilibrium theory of biogeography, or does it deviate from that expected relationship? And if it deviates, this is when it starts to get interesting, because then you can start to delve into the question of why it deviates, of what else is going on. So again, when we have a framework to test a hypothesis, this gives us a sort of foundation to start asking some more interesting questions about the factors that control species diversity on islands. So how well does this most simplistic model of equilibrium theory of island biogeography actually explain what exists in nature? This has been tested countless times, both observationally and experimentally, And here is a particularly famous example that tested this relationship experimentally. So in the 1960s, there were 4 small mangrove islands in the Florida Keys, and the researchers killed off all of the arthropods on these islands using an insecticide. So research ethics approvals were much easier to get in the 1960s. That's the first take home from this experiment. So they killed off all the arthropods, and then they were able to subsequently or afterwards measure the rate of recolonization of the islands by arthropods. And again, they're testing the equilibrium theory of island biogeography, so they're looking at recolonization rates as a function of island distance from the mainland. And they can also use the equilibrium theory of biogeography as a framework to test hypotheses about what the new equilibrium number of species will be. So how will the once equilibrium is reestablished, what is that equilibrium species richness going to be as a function of distance from the mainland? So this graph here was one of the main figures to summarize the findings of this experiment. So on this graph, you can see days since the experiment began on the x-axis. So this is days since the insecticide was applied. And on the y-axis, you can see the number of species present on those small mangrove islands. So E1 is the most distant island, and consistent with the equilibrium theory of island biogeography, it had the slowest rate of colonization by new species. So it took species much longer to reach the farther island. So fewer species arrived on E1, and it reached equilibrium at a smaller number of species. So equilibrium is where the curve more or less starts to flatten out. Now E2 was the nearest island, and it had the highest rate of colonization of species, and also the highest equilibrium number of species. So again, when the curve flattens out and we've reached that new equilibrium, it had the greatest species richness. So this graph, this experiment, supports the simplest model of equilibrium theory of island biogeography, that colonization and equilibrium number of species is related to degree of isolation of an island or distance from the mainland. So to briefly summarize the main findings of this experiment, distant islands had the lowest rate of immigration and turnover. The islands closest to the mainland had the highest species richness and turnover. And the islands reached equilibrium within 2 years. So 2 years to reach equilibrium, but the community composition of arthropods was different compared to pre-defaunation. So the species that were there before they applied the insecticide were different from the species that arrived afterwards. So only about 19 to 40% of species were conserved. So this means that on the 4 different islands, only about 19 to 40% of the species were also present before the insecticide was applied. So again, to remember that equilibrium theory of biogeography is looking at species richness. It's not looking at which species are actually present. So species composition can change, but equilibrium number of species supported is going to stay the same. So species richness stays the same, community composition can change over time. So this simple theory, equilibrium theory of island biogeography, again, as I mentioned, has been tested countless times since it was originally introduced in the 1960s. In some cases, like the defaunation experiment I just talked about, the data support even this simple model of equilibrium island biogeography. And other times, this simple theory does not explain what's observed in nature. And this theory has also undergone a number of revisions since this earliest model that we've been talking about. So again, this is the part where we're going to start to add complexity to this basic model. We're going to start to add some new considerations in. We're going to start to make it slightly more complicated. Now, the biggest omission or factor not accounted for in this original theory that I've been talking about is human influence, is our influence. Dispersal over oceans is not the same barrier that it once was, because humans, we now move species around, first by ship and now by ship or air travel. So rat and goat infestations have decimated the species diversity of many island chains. We've also greatly modified the landscapes of islands. We've introduced invasive species other than rats and goats. Agriculture has been a huge influence on island species diversity. And so island biogeography is still undergoing the process of revision to try to account for human influences. And this is a little bit more difficult to do than you might think. But to give you some examples, so again, this is ongoing. We are still working to revise island biogeography to account for the Anthropocene, so an Anthropocene version of island biogeography. But some of the revisions that have started to be made is we've started to rethink how we think about island isolation. So distance from the mainland is not the same barrier it once was, but we could think about economic isolation, for example. So basically thinking about shipping traffic, tourism traffic. Economically isolated islands have reduced tourism and shipping, which is going to reduce the number of species that can be transported to the island with humans as the vector. So instead of distance from the mainland, you can think about economic isolation. So the pictures on this slide here are really just to reiterate and emphasize my point that invasive species on islands have played a huge role in determining the species richness we observe on islands today, particularly goats and rats. So goats and rats are a huge problem for island biodiversity, and a problem that requires active eradication in many cases. So if you hike certain islands in the Galapagos, for example, it's very common to see rat poison pellets. So the island biogeography theory of the Anthropocene has to take into account invasive species. Another important revision that has occurred to the equilibrium theory of island biogeography since it was first introduced is the rescue effect. So in the original theory, remember that extinction rates are solely related to island size. The smaller the island, the greater the rate of extinction. But with this revision, the idea of a rescue effect is also recognizing the role that island isolation plays in extinction rates. So islands closer to the mainland have higher immigration rates. So if you have a declining population on the verge of extinction, you're much more likely to have immigration of new individuals from the mainland to bolster that declining population. So islands closer to the mainland are going to have a lower rate of extinction than islands further from the mainland because you have a greater source of new individuals to maintain a population that's already present on the island. So in this revision, the rescue effect recognizes both isolation and island size when examining extinction rates. So this figure here is showing again the original theory of island biogeography, the one that only considers island isolation effects on immigration, so not looking at island isolation effects on extinction. So again, original theory, near versus far islands influences only immigration, not extinction. This figure here is assuming that both islands are the same size, the only difference is how close they are to the mainland. So original theory, the far island is going to have a lower rate of immigration than the near island, but both are going to have the same extinction rate because they're the same size. This is the original theory, and now we're going to modify that to consider the rescue effect. So now we've added that rescue effect in. So again, we still have two islands, a near island and a far island, and these two islands are the same size. Now, the near versus far island, the island isolation, is going to influence both immigration and extinction. So far islands have lower immigration rates and higher extinction rates compared to near islands, resulting in a much lower equilibrium number of species than a near island of the same size. So once again, with the rescue effect, far island, you're going to have lower immigration rates and higher extinction rates, resulting in a much lower equilibrium species richness. So again, look here on the x-axis, look at the equilibrium number of species for the far island compared to the near one. So the difference between the two is much more stark than it is in the previous example. So there's a much greater difference in equilibrium number of species between a far and near island of the same size under the rescue effect revision than under the original theory. And this is because island isolation now influences both sides of the equation. It influences both immigration and extinction. So now we're going to consider another revision in the original theory of island biogeography, the target area effect. So what we're going to do now is the exact same exercise that we just did for the rescue effect, but now we're going to keep distance from the mainland constant and look only at island size. So in this example, we're going to compare a small island versus a large island. In the original equilibrium theory of island biogeography, island size only influenced extinction rates. It did not influence immigration rates. In the revised theory, so when you consider the target area effect, island size also influences immigration rates. So think of it as target practice. The larger your target, the more likely you are to hit it. So the larger the island, the more likely a species is to arrive there when it disperses. So for example, think about a sweepstakes dispersal event. That is much more likely to be successful if there's a larger island area, a greater shoreline to potentially land on compared to a smaller island. So larger target area, larger chance of having a successful dispersal event than a smaller island where a dispersing species is more likely to miss the island completely. So this figure is once again visually showing the original theory of equilibrium theory of island biogeography. So again, we have two islands, same distance from the mainland. One is a small island, one is a large island. So the small versus the large island have the exact same immigration rate under the original theory, but different extinction rates. So you have higher extinction rates for the small island than you do for the large island. So now we're going to bring in this idea of target area. So again, you can visualize this as an archer shooting at a target. So in the original theory, again, we consider the effect of distance from the target. The closer you are to your target, the more likely you are to hit it. So that's why isolation is associated with immigration rates. But now I want you to look at these three targets and imagine them being at an equal distance from the archer, except the size of the target is going to vary. So you have a large target, a medium target, and a small target. So unless you have a really, really good archer, the success rate, the number of times the archer hits the target, there's going to be a much higher rate of success for the larger target compared to the smaller target. So the archer is going to be much more likely to miss the smaller target, unless, of course, you're talking about someone with very, very good aim. But if you imagine yourself shooting an arrow at a target, you're going to be much more likely to hit the larger one than the smaller one. And it's the same idea when you're thinking about dispersal events. So the dispersal event is much more likely to be successful if the island is larger. There's a greater area for the species to hit, a greater shoreline for the species dispersing to arrive at. So now here in this plot, we've revised the original theory original equilibrium theory of biogeography to include the influence of island size on both extinction and immigration rates. So again, the distance from the mainland is the same for these two islands, these two theoretical islands we're talking about. The only difference is that one island is large and one island is small. So the larger island is going to have a higher immigration rate and a lower extinction rate compared to the small island. And so that larger island is going to support a greater equilibrium number of species. So again, just like with the rescue effect, when you start to consider the influence of island size on both sides of the equation, extinction and immigration, the difference in equilibrium number of species between the large and the small island is going to be much greater than it would be under the original theory that only considers the effect of island size on extinction rates. So some other factors to consider. So biological factors. The classical theory, that simplest model of equilibrium theory of biogeography, doesn't take into account species interaction. So again, we're not considering anything about what species are present and how they're interacting. We're just looking at the total number of species. But of course, this is a course on biogeography. We've talked about a few examples where species interactions can be very important for determining the number of species and how those species are interacting as part of a community. So we have specialist and generalist species. A specialist feeder may need a certain food source that might not be present. So that species might arrive on the island, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be successful at colonizing that island. Equilibrium theory of island biogeography doesn't really take that into account, even though we know that the factors that make a species more likely to be a successful disperser to an island are not necessarily the same factors that make that species a good colonizer. If we think about the extinction part of the curve, the extinction of one taxa might inevitably mean the extinction of a second taxa. Again, equilibrium theory is assuming that each species is independent of one another, so it's just looking at total number of species. But of course, species interactions can be very important. Species are not always independent of one another, and in fact, more often are interacting with one another. And lastly, I'd like you to consider the non-equilibrium effect. So imagine you were to go to an island and measure the number of species on that island. Can you be sure that that island is at equilibrium? If you're not measuring change over time, like if you don't have that curve that we saw in the defaunation experiment in the Florida mangrove islands, how do you know the curve is flattened out? How do you know you've reached equilibrium? So is that basic assumption of the theory of island biogeography correct? We can take this further. What does equilibrium mean to a historical biogeographer compared to an ecological biogeographer? Or in other words, how might someone who studies biogeography on millennial timescales view equilibrium compared to somebody studying the same processes on a decadal scale or an annual scale? So our activities, human activities, have disrupted virtually every location on the planet. Does equilibrium even exist? So these are some philosophical questions that I'm going to leave you with, but I want you to remember from this lecture that the equilibrium theory of island biogeography remains today an active and very exciting area of discovery, fundamental for our understanding of controls on species diversity. And this despite the fact that it was first introduced more than 50 years ago and has been shown to be overly simplistic in some cases. So it continues to be fundamental to our understanding of the biogeography, not only of islands, but in general. We can apply island biogeography theory to islands in lakes, for example. We can apply it to quadrants in a woodlot. So this is why the equilibrium theory of island biogeography has been so influential in the fields of biogeography, ecology, and evolution.